I was in charge of the investigation of the assassination for the U.S. House of Representatives from 77 to 79. The Select Committee's, it's a committee of Congress, so nominally its objective is to investigate for the purpose of determining whether or not additional legislation should be passed. But in reality, the purpose of the investigation was to reinvestigate the case from all angles. And the reason for that was that there was a large part of the American public that did not believe the findings of the Warren Commission, didn't think that they could be trusted in their findings, and so they wanted another investigation. And that's the one that we did. So all aspects of it were reinvestigated. Whether Oswald was involved, if so, to what extent, was there a conspiracy, if so, who might be the conspirators, etc. We obviously had an obstacle, which was that 15-year span. And memories tend to fade, witnesses die, etc. So while we had investigators who interviewed people in a normal way, much of what you could have done had you been given the assignment to investigate it in 63 and 64 was no longer possible. So we devoted most of our resources to two things: science, and we not only redid all of the sciences, ballistics, handwriting, etc., that were done by the Warren Commission. There were new sciences available to us that were not available to the Warren Commission, the most significant of which was the acoustics analysis we did, which led to the conclusion that there were 4 shots fired and 2 shooters. In addition to that, the government's files were full of relevant information that the Warren Commission had never looked at. In the mafia field, as an example, there were illegal wiretaps on all the major mafia figures throughout the United States, with the exception of Santos Travacani and Carlos Marcello. The Warren Commission, if you're going to investigate the case, you've got to look at the possibility of the mafia. And the Warren Commission had never bothered to look at any of those transcripts. In fact, the Warren Commission never had a single lead run out for it by the organized crime section of the FBI or the organized crime section of the Justice Department. Again, to illustrate, if you're going to investigate, you need to look at the possibility of anti-Castro Cubans. The CIA's files were full of that because they were either financing, or if not financing, monitoring, depending on the group, all the major anti-Castro groups that were strewn along our Gulf Coast during the early 1960s. We negotiated the first ever, I think, congressional access to CIA files on the basis of sources and methods left in, no redacting. So we, for the first time, looked at all that stuff. The Warren Commission guys actually testified in our hearings that they thought that if the CIA had had anything, they would have given it to them, and the CIA testified that they thought if the Warren Commission had wanted something, they would have asked for it. So there was no exchange of that kind of information during the original investigation. So those are just examples. So one of the things that I talked a lot about here at the seminar is what I think was the strongest and the most significant finding of the Select Committee on Assassinations, the most significant finding, and that is that the Warren Commission never conducted a conspiracy investigation and then lied to us about the result. To a lesser degree of certainty, but to a high degree of probability, I believe that the evidence reflects that there were 2 shooters, and that means there was a conspiracy. Dropping down from that, at lower levels of certainty, we came up with worlds of new information as to who might have been involved in that conspiracy, but could not resolve that to any great degree of certainty. There was a lot of new evidence suggesting the possibility of the mafia. There was a lot of new evidence suggesting the possibility of anti-Castro Cubans, and in fact, not only my committee, but the Senate committee, who looked into the Cuban assassination plots right before our committee started. Both we and they concluded that the presence of the CIA mafia plots, they were conspiring together to kill Castro suggested the possibility that Castro found out about those plots and may have either turned someone around and sent him back or retaliated through someone else against the president. One of the things that we did discover by going down and talking to Castro was that he did know, he had learned of those plots, but he said, you know, it would have been crazy for him to have, you know, retaliated against the President of the United States, and in fact he didn't. That was his testimony. I wrote a book that's called, after 20 years later, it's called Real Answers, and I sort of defined it in there as being the answer based on the weight of the credible evidence, very similar to a court standard. And based upon that, and again, I'm just talking about what we came up with, I thought Oswald was involved. I thought Oswald was probably a shooter. So I think that the Warren Commission was probably right about that. On the other hand, even their handling of that investigation has raised lots of issues over the years, but, you know, trials of O.J. Simpson or whoever else you want to talk about raise a lot of issues. And but at any rate, to answer your question, I thought he was probably on the weight of the credible evidence involved as a shooter. The Warren Commission's investigation was really as ludicrous, in one sense, as you know, as if you know, Eliot Ness were to have caught a truck full of bootleg whiskey coming across the Canadian border, and become immediately satisfied that he had arrested or killed the truck driver, and that was the end of the investigation. They were trying to get a quick answer. They made up their minds before they ever started what answer they wanted. They set the machinery of the government in gear to convince us of that predetermined outcome. They never investigated. And that's not, that I can tell you to an absolute certainty. Or as close as anything can be an absolute certainty. There is no, in my view, no credible counter to that position. And the reason there's no, you know, there's no credible other side to that, I mean, it is a long story, but the short version of it is that the memos that they wrote setting up the Warren Commission made it clear that's what they were going to do. Not investigate, but convince us. They picked a blue ribbon panel not to investigate, but to convince us through their prestige that that was the answer. These are all in memos that were written before they ever started. J. Edgar Hoover had decided the issue, put the report on the President's desk before they started to investigate, and there was no way that J. Edgar Hoover was going to let the FBI come up with a conclusion to impeach his finding that he made before they started. And of course, if you look through the FBI's volumes, you will see that basically whenever there was a conspiracy allegation, FBI found a way to drop it like a hot potato.